In 2004, a blue and yellow ticket in your hand meant Friday night was saved. It was a ritual. You walked into the store, you scoured the aisles for the last copy of the newest release, and you accepted that if you brought it back a day late, you'd pay for the sin. It wasn't just a video rental store. It was the center of pop culture. And for a company with 9,000 stores, it felt like the center of the world. Then, a man walked into a boardroom with a $50 million offer, and the CEO of the world's biggest company laughed at him. He didn't know he was laughing at his own funeral. By the mid-2000s, Blockbuster wasn't just a video store. It was the largest entertainment landlord on the planet. We're talking 9,000 stores across 25 countries. If you lived in a suburban neighborhood in the US, or even globally, you didn't rent a movie, you went to Blockbuster. It was a cultural institution. It was the place where you went to feel like you were part of the mainstream. But while the bright blue and yellow signs on the storefronts looked welcoming, the business model underneath was built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated friction. Blockbuster made its money in a way that modern companies would call predatory. See, they didn't just make money when you rented a movie. They made a massive chunk of their revenue, nearly $800 million a year at their peak, off of late fees. Think about that for a second. Their most profitable product wasn't the movie. It was your failure to return it on time. They had engineered a system where the customer's inconvenience was the company's profit margin. It was a beautiful, dark, and incredibly effective cycle of psychological manipulation. They relied on you forgetting to rewind the tape, or getting busy on a Sunday night, or just being human. For the people in the boardroom, this was genius. Why would they ever change? Why would they ever innovate, when their customers were literally paying them to be forgetful? They had a captive audience, an army of employees in every zip code, and a brand that everyone recognized. They were so big, so dominant, that they stopped looking at their customers as human beings who wanted entertainment. They started looking at them as data points in a spreadsheet, predictable, manageable, and, most importantly, profitable. They believed they had mastered the market. They were the king of the castle, sitting on a throne made of plastic DVD cases and VHS tapes. But empires built on friction are fragile. The moment the friction disappears, the empire starts to crumble. And at the time, Blockbuster didn't realize that their greatest strength, that massive, physical footprint, was about to become their heaviest anchor. Then came the moment that changed everything. The year was 2000. Blockbuster was riding high, literally untouchable. And into their Dallas boardroom walked a man named Reed Hastings. He was the founder of a tiny, struggling startup called Netflix. At the time, Netflix was nothing more than a DVD by-mail service. It was slow, it was niche, and honestly, it was desperate for cash. Hastings had an offer. He pitched it to John Antioco, the CEO of Blockbuster. He offered to sell Netflix to Blockbuster for $50 million. $50 million. To you and me, that's a fortune. To Blockbuster, a company pulling in billions, it was pocket change. It was a rounding error on their annual budget. And you know what the executives did? They didn't negotiate. They didn't ask for a due diligence report. They didn't even take it seriously. They laughed. They literally laughed the man out of the boardroom. In that room, they weren't looking at a competitor. They were looking at a fly that needed to be swatted. They were so blinded by their own success, so drunk on the power of their 9,000 stores, that they couldn't conceive of a world where people didn't want to drive to a store, stand in line, and hope the movie they wanted was in stock. They suffered from what we call the curse of the successful. When you are at the top, you stop looking for the next wave, because you're too busy surfing the current one. They believed their own press releases. They thought that because they were the biggest, they were also the smartest. But that laugh? That dismissiveness? That was the sound of a giant walking off a cliff and not realizing it yet. By rejecting that $50 million deal, they didn't just walk away from a potential bargain, they handed the keys to the kingdom to their executioner. They had just defined their future, adapt or die. And they had officially chosen to die. The subscriber bleed wasn't just a concern, it had turned into a full-blown hemorrhage. Blockbuster's business model was fundamentally broken, and the math was turning against them in real time. See, in the world of the audit, we call this the death spiral. Blockbuster had massive overhead. They were paying rent, electricity, and staff for 9,000 physical locations. To keep those doors open, they needed those late fees. They needed you to be late so they could pay the bills. But as customers started realizing they could get DVDs in the mail, without leaving their house and without the threat of a late fee, they abandoned Blockbuster in droves. So, what did Blockbuster do? They panicked. They raised prices. They tightened their grip. But every time they squeezed, the customers left faster. It was a vicious cycle. Less revenue meant they had to squeeze harder, which drove more customers to Netflix, which meant less revenue. It was a mathematical trap. The more they fought to stay relevant, the more they accelerated their own demise. While Netflix was lean, digital, and growing, Blockbuster was becoming a bloated, expensive relic of the 90s. They weren't just losing customers. They were losing the type of customer that mattered. They were left with the fringe, the people who didn't have internet access, or who were still holding on to the physical ritual. The core, the families, the movie buffs? They had already moved on. By 2010, the financial cracks were visible to everyone except the people holding the pen. The company's debt began to pile up, reaching billions. Interest payments were eating whatever profit they had left alive. They were effectively operating on borrowed time. They were technically insolvent. They owed more money than they were worth. This is the cold, hard truth of a business autopsy. A company can survive a bad quarter. They can survive a bad year. But they cannot survive a model that the world has collectively decided to stop using. They had spent decades optimizing a system that the world no longer wanted. They were the most efficient video rental store on the planet, in a world that was rapidly deciding it didn't want to rent videos anymore. The golden goose wasn't just sickly, it was already dead. They just hadn't realized that the store was empty. When the writing is on the wall, you don't paint over it. You read it. But Blockbuster? They tried to redecorate. By the late 2000s, it finally dawned on the board that Netflix wasn't a fad. They realized that their massive, physical footprint, the 9,000 stores they once bragged about, had become a massive, expensive anchor. So, in a final act of desperation, they launched Blockbuster Online and their Total Access program. On paper, it was actually a stroke of genius. It was a hybrid model. You could order online, and if you wanted, you could return the movies to a local store. It combined the convenience of the mail-order model with the instant gratification of a physical location. For a fleeting moment, it looked like the giant had finally woken up. They gained millions of subscribers. They were finally fighting back. But this is where the autopsy reveals the fatal flaw. It was a classic case of too little, too late. By the time they launched these services, Netflix had already spent a decade building brand loyalty, perfecting their recommendation algorithm, and training customers to expect a digital experience. Blockbuster was playing catch-up while their store operations were bleeding cash. They were trapped in a classic dilemma. If they pushed their online service too hard, they cannibalized their own store revenue. If they didn't push it hard enough, they lost to Netflix. They were trying to save the ship while simultaneously drilling holes in the hull. The strategy wasn't about innovation anymore. It was about survival. But in the digital age, you can't survive your way into a new era. You have to rebuild your foundation. Blockbuster didn't have the stomach or the balance sheet to burn their stores to the ground and start fresh. They kept trying to prop up the old model while building the new one, and in the process, they did neither well. They spent millions on marketing, millions on infrastructure, and millions on trying to convince customers that they were still relevant. But the market had already moved on. Customers didn't want a hybrid model. They didn't want the remnants of the old world dressed up in new clothes. They wanted the future. And Blockbuster, despite all their billions, was still anchored to the past. The final blue and yellow sign came down not with a bang, but with a quiet, forgotten whimper. Blockbuster didn't just go bankrupt. They became a punchline, a cautionary tale that sits in the history books of every business school in the world. But if you look closely at the corpse of this empire, you realize the truth. Blockbuster wasn't killed by Netflix. They weren't killed by the internet, and they weren't killed by changing consumer habits. They were killed by their own reflection. They became so enamored with the image of the industry leader that they stopped serving the customer and started serving the brand. They spent their final years protecting a monument to a world that had already moved on. This is the ultimate lesson of the audit. Success is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a business. It creates a blind spot. It makes you believe that because you are big, you are invincible. It makes you laugh at the $50 million deal that would have saved your life. It makes you think you can legislate, price gouge, and ignore your way to the top forever. But history is cold. It doesn't care about your market share, your legacy, or your 9,000 locations. History only cares about utility. The moment you stop being useful, the moment you become an obstacle to the future rather than a part of it, the world will leave you behind, without a second thought. The blue and yellow sign is gone. The late fees have been erased. And in their place, we have a digital world that doesn't care about Friday night rituals. It cares about convenience, speed, and value. The next time you see a giant company acting like they own the world, remember this story. Remember that the bigger the throne, the harder it is to jump off when the building starts to burn. The audit is closed. And the lesson is simple: don't fall in love with your own success, or you'll be the first one to watch it die.